Greetings. Let's talk. So today we're going to do something a little different. As some of you may know, one of my areas of interest includes metal casting, with a specific eye towards casting medallions. And basically, that's what we're talking about here. But really, that's only half of the reason this video is even being made. The other half goes back to December of last year, the day of Vindheim's premier coronet tournament. It was decided months before that the reign would begin the same day as the tournament, so there really was no heirs period. The clock started, effectively, when the winner landed the winning sword blow. For Romanius and Diana, not only would this be their first time as territorial prince and princess, but it would be the principality's first time, well, being a principality. There was just a lot of things that didn't really come to mind beforehand in a situation like that. One of those, as it happened, is what led to the video today. But before I get ahead of myself, let me tell you this in the order it happened. About an hour after the tournament, I walked up to Her Newly Made Highness, Diana, in order to offer an invitation to our baronial Yule revel happening just a week later, 6 days actually. As I walked away from handing that invitation over, Marcus ran up to me and stopped me. Now, if you don't know Marcus, or rather at least what he looks like, I'm not terribly surprised. Either by habit or accident, up until recently, the number of photos with him were surprisingly few and far between. You'd think he was allergic to a camera or something. Here, this is the man in question. I've known him for years, and between the two of us, we've been die-hard Northerners and rabble-rousers and comrades-in-arms for well over a decade or so up here. Anyway, Marcus stops me and asks, "Hey Ivo, can I ask you a big favor?" I shrug. "Sure, what is it?" "At Yule next week, I was wondering if you could fit in an extra tournament to the schedule." I blinked at the man and gave him a look that I am quite sure told him what I thought of that idea. "Have you taken leave of your senses?" I almost yelled. "We are less than a week away. Hell, 6 days. What in the hell makes you think I want to try and add a tournament this late in the game?" The poor man blinked at me, obviously a little taken aback at my rebuke. I wanted to hold the Princess's Rapier Championship there." And then it hit me. There was absolutely no other time this conversation could have happened. Without knowing who was going to be the royals beforehand, an idea like this could only happen now, and no sooner. And if this is sounding even remotely familiar, Isildur and I talked about the very same conversation in a previous video. If you want to hear her and my take on it, I'll make sure to put a link in the notes. So, that was how the Barony of Wiesenfeuer wound up hosting the first ever Principality Rapier Championship. As something of a footnote to all this, just to give you some measure of what type of mutual troublemakers Marcus and I are, I was called into court the morning of Yule. Actually, I was called in by my own baronesses, but before I could return to my seat, Mistress Adalia, the court herald for their highnesses, smirked knowingly and said loudly, "Ivo, you do not yet have leave to exit court." This is where I was called into court as the first item of business for Romanius and Diana. Not just for that day, or even for that reign, but this was the first ever piece of court business in a Vindheim Principality court ever. This is where I got my Sable Talon, an AOA award for archery in this case. But as you can see here, this is Marcus running out from behind the thrones in the middle of the presentation to hand over to their highnesses his talon that he received 8 years before. He gave that medallion to them to give to me, which makes it now a legacy award. But beside that, this isn't about me or even really about Marcus. I just want to kind of frame what's going to go forward on this. So like I said, that day was, among a few other things, the first ever Principality Rapier Championship tournament. Just about every rapier fighter that could make it showed up, and as far as I could tell, they brought their A game, because everyone was showing some excellent fights out there. I don't want to say I was surprised at who won, because that wouldn't be fair. But after everything else that had gone on that week, both in the public sphere and behind the scenes in order to make this happen, I was honestly not expecting Marcus to add Principality Rapier Champion to his itinerary. But he did. And so began the process of creating the first pages in that part of the Principality's traditions. Of course, one of the things that was created was a need for insignia for the new champion. And this was something that I know Marcus has been working on for a while now. Then finally, right toward the end of the rain, the proverbial stars lined up, and he was able to create a clay model of the medallion he was trying to design. Now, the only thing left was to make the model into something durable and eye-catching. Really, the only practical answer was brass. As large as it was, pewter would have been too soft, and any of the harder metals like steel or iron, even with a protective coating on them, would have almost certainly rusted immediately or very soon after. Anything else would have been too expensive or too soft, or worse yet, both. Now, there are two things you have to understand about casting here. First is that I've been doing it for about 2 years now. I started just before COVID hit and had the pleasure of doing 2 runs of coins. One were my own set made for voice heralds, and the other were 3 custom largesse coins for their highnesses. Casting is at its core simple, but make no mistake about it, it's not easy. In fact, it's easy to screw up. Once you know the basics, you can do a serviceable job. But if you really want to capture detail, you have to have a good understanding of geometry, some physics, and you need a lot of patience. Marcus had never had a chance to cast and wasn't happy about jumping in blind on the subject. Also, it does take some specialized tools. Not a lot, and they're not terribly expensive by themselves, but if you're going to buy them all at one time, it's a not small purchase. He reached out to me and we set a date to meet up and cast his clay model into brass. He had the brass and the tools to melt it. Oh, did I mention he had the fire too? That's kind of important here. Actually, that fire was why I met him at his workshop. I don't have anything hot enough to melt brass. Pewter melts at a much, much lower temperature, so I'm able to use an electric hot plate in my garage if I want to do any work here. Brass, that's a whole nother level, and it needed, well, a real fire, as you can see here. So while he was piling up coal and running the blower at full speed to get the crucible hot, I was working on the cast itself. First of all, what the sand is a 180 grit fine powder that has been sifted down multiple times. Then an additive agent, an adhesive, is mixed in so it sticks together. As fancy as that sounds, in reality, there are usually one of 2 things that I've seen used as an adhesive additive. One is oil. The other is clay. In the case of oil, I'm not joking when I say I've seen used motor oil poured in and mixed into a pot of sand. Clay is actually a little more refined. One of the more common sources that I have seen cited is clay cat litter. It's usually ground into a fine powder and mixed in a 10-to-1 or 8-to-1 ratio by volume. This gives the sand enough body to hold its shape, but also lets it crumble when you break it apart. The major drawback with oil is it will literally ignite when you hit it with some molten metals. Clay is more resistant, but even still, with something like iron or steel, you will get charring on the mold. And you don't want those black chunks going back into your pot of casting sand. They'll ruin the next mold you do. The first thing I did was coat the face of the medallion with talcum powder. That helps keep the sand from sticking to the master itself. Then I put the form around it and packed the sand on top of it with a hammer. I'm sorry I didn't get any video of me actually packing it, but trust me, these were not love taps. I needed to make sure the cast was rock solid, or else it might collapse when we poured the brass into it. After that, I turned the whole thing over and used one of my shaping tools to cut a trench around the medallion. This trench helps make a tighter seal between the 2 halves and prevents brass from oozing out between the mold halves. After that, I dusted all of the loose sand off the surface, then locked the back half of the mold to the front and placed sand on top of that. Again, I used a hammer to compact the sand down against the clay master and the existing half of the mold. Once I was satisfied it was firm enough, I pulled the molds apart to see what I had. I actually pulled the master out of the sand with a piece of electrical tape, but I was really glad at how little it actually stuck to the sand at all. Now, the resulting impression captures about 95% of what we were looking for, and both Marcus and I were thrilled at what we had gotten. I used the same tool to make sure I had a clean pour spout for the brass to flow into, and then I put the 2 halves of the mold together again very carefully. I'm not going to lie, putting them together is just a little nerve-wracking. If they don't line up and the wrong parts connect, the sand can crumble and ruin the mold. In my case, I have indexing blocks on the mold, which make sure everything is locked together in the right orientation. I just have to swallow my anxiety and trust the tools that I made. Then, after about another 20 minutes of waiting for the brass to finally melt, we were at the moment of the pour. This I made sure to get a video of. We walked through who was going to be standing where, because we knew Marcus would only have a few moments before the metal cooled enough to ruin the pour. Haldora, who was with us, ran the camera, and I stood back while Marcus maneuvered the red-hot crucible. I'm tag teaming with you on this one. Once it was poured, I made everyone step away and wait. I knew the brass would take a bit to cool, and I didn't want to risk any hot pockets of molten or still soft metal when we didn't have to. Giving it a few didn't hurt anyone, and with as hot as the metal probably would be for a while, it was safer to top it all off. But after 10 minutes, which I admit were longer than was strictly needed, I said, let's do this. And we went to work retrieving the casting. Go ahead and start with that. Yep, and this is coming. This is pewter only from now on. I might rebuild it, I might throw it out.
Ooh, pretty.
Come here, old girl. Yeah, the mold took beautifully.
Oh, yeah.
That. Oh, wow. Look at that. Yeah, a little bit of impurities, but early period casting style, that's not even remotely off the till. All right, let's get this over here.
You can see this design so well.
I love how the clamshell actually showed out.
Mm-hmm.
It took everything. It took everything. Nothing there a little burnishing won't fix in a hurry. Part of me was a little worried because of the discoloration, but I'll be honest with you, number one, that's period. But number two, it
Looks awesome.
doesn't take anything away from the design at all.
No, it actually looks really awesome, especially with the way that color's made.
At the end of the day, the hours we spent together making this cast happen were more about the camaraderie than the metal itself. And the reason I'm making this video is to help show you, my audience, the story that went into this part of the Medallion's journey into existence. Even now, after being cooled and brushed, there is still a few hours of cleaning and sanding to do in order to get the edge to the circle matching the intended design. It'll have to be drilled and the hole mounted to the collar that's already waiting for it. And then it'll have to be presented to their highnesses just before they step down as the first royalty of the principality. But still, in all of that, friends came together on a warm day in June and wrote a page in the principality history. That page is as much about the men and women who will wear the medallion in the future as the medallion itself. It is about a legacy that started back on a cold day in December when Marcus won that tournament. And it's also about the legacy of two friends who came together before that to pave the way to help this page in Kingdom history take place in the first place. This is the story of that medallion. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, I'll see you at the next event. Goodbye, and God bless.